Hi there, and welcome to the Markets UK podcast with Nick Shepley. And this week I want to talk about the annual round of talks at Davos. Yes, strap yourself in for a roller coaster ride. We're going to talk about the World Economic Forum. Now, if you don't know what Davos is or what the World Economic Forum is, don't worry, you're not alone. The majority of the population don't. The assumption is that this is some kind of meeting of world leaders, something to do with the United Nations, some kind of international conference. And it's not really. It is a private meeting of originally entrepreneurs, bankers, businessmen, and later a means by which politicians could hang on as well. This meeting has no real official status at all. So it's a bit worrying how staggeringly powerful the meetings every year at Davos actually are. At this small resort in Switzerland, really the macroeconomic policy of the whole world is ironed out. Which leads me to my key question of the day: what, if anything, do Eurosceptics make of Davos? It's in Europe after all, so they probably hate it. Okay. When indignant middle-aged men of a certain jingoistic persuasion, British men I must add, raised on a diet of the Dam Busters and the Cockleshell Heroes and 633 Squadron and the Longest Day and all that, when they decide to become indignant about something, they tend to become indignant about Europe. The middle-brow press, knowing its audience, and desperate to maintain its shrinking readership, keep the indignation topped up with a diet of inflammatory news coverage suggesting that unelected Eurocrats are eroding those sacred British rights decided at the Magna Carta and during the Civil War, and transforming the character of our nation. Parliament and British courts, we are reminded, now play second fiddle to European law and the European Court of Human Rights. Britain has lost sovereignty. Even worse, she has abandoned it without a fight. And this is why columnists of the Daily Mail and the bigwigs of the UK Independence Party so frequently reference Britain's wartime struggles, suggesting that everything we fought for from 1939 to 45 has been surrendered by a generation not worthy of their forebears. Well, yes, almost everything Britain went to war for has been lost, in one way or another. But almost none of this is related to or the fault of Brussels. While we linger on the issue of Europe, we should acknowledge for a moment the sobering truth that for the past 6.5 decades, largely due to the development of a continent-wide economic and quasi-political union, there has been an unprecedented era of peace, stability and security. Whatever those who would like to see an end to the EU would propose in its stead, it will hopefully be able to confer upon us similar benefits. Sovereignty in Britain, and in every other country that is deeply integrated into the world economy, has been progressively eroded since the end of World War II by market forces. The future direction of our economy has been decided this week not in Brussels, but in Davos, Switzerland. We have far less to fear from the predations of officious Eurocrats than from the predations of investment bankers, the politicians who facilitate them, and Bono, who always seems to be at these things. Yes, this week the World Economic Forum meets once more for its annual get-together at Davos in Switzerland, where the world's elected and unelected meet together and decide economic and monetary policies which will never be discussed in any parliament or debating chamber. The economic sovereignty of most nations, for better or worse, in the Western world is routinely compromised at the World Economic Forum, and yet there is not a fleeting mention of an anti-Davos policy in any UKIP publicity, or a Peter Hitchens polemic about it in the Mail. Why is it that our attention is focused on the events of one part of Europe and not another? The conspiracy theory line would probably focus on the presence, most years, of Rupert Murdoch at Davos, and similar media luminaries with the power and scope to set our news agenda. But the truth, as ever, is probably more banal. It is so much easier to tap into old jingoisms, so much easier to direct public ire against Brussels than it is to focus on more esoteric targets. But I am never one to turn down a challenge, so that's why I'm going to attempt it today. First, we must delve a little into the past of the WEF. It was founded in 1971 by a Swiss business studies professor called Klaus Schwab, under the original title of the European Management Forum, and it was as egalitarian as meetings of large business get, with the inclusion of employees groups. This, of course, was in the 1970s and during the heyday of Europe's social democratic moment, where, in a bid to disabuse workers with the notion that communism to the east was a happy state of affairs, they were routinely included in workplace discussions and debates in most European countries. The moment that we decided that communism wasn't a threat anymore after 1989, these cosy discussions came to an abrupt halt. Anyway, the EMF was designed to bridge the cultural gap between Europe and America, and it was designed to help introduce these new US managerial styles to older European businesses. 2 years later, in 1973, the world is plunged into economic crisis. It was a year of immense change for the global economy. The Arab-Israeli War of Yom Kippur saw the world plunged into crisis as the price of oil skyrocketed as Saudi Arabia and other oil-producing nations punished the West. And in addition to this, the Bretton Woods Agreement that kept currencies fixed since 1944 collapsed as Nixon finally withdrew the dollar from the gold standard. Not only the scope of the EMF, but its emphasis began to change in 1973. In response to these crises, the EMF metaphorically stepped up and enhanced its role and took upon a more guiding, strategic, and dare I say, political mantle as the sort of the proposer of the solutions to the world's problems. And these solutions are obviously always free market solutions. In 1974, for the first time, political leaders were invited to attend as Davos became the scene for diplomatic resolution as well as business networking. The EMF was rebranded the World Economic Forum in 1987, and its elevation to global significance heralded the beginnings of our modern understandings of this notion of globalization. Globalization is a term so nebulous and so diffuse that it can mean many different things, but at Davos it came to be defined as the globalization of finance and the freedom for money to move across the globe unhindered by anything as mundane as a national government. Davos became, and still is, the annual convention for those advocates of the neoliberal model of globalization and finance, who come each year to celebrate their successes, congratulate one another, and pay homage to an ideology that has now officially run riot. In the mid-2000s, this ideological consensus crowed ever louder about the infallibility of markets, and all known problems from wars in the Middle East to the scourge of malaria was seen as remediable by the freeing up of capital from constraints of the nation. Then the crash of 2008 happened, and suddenly everything looked very different. The certainties that had dominated the prevailing order since the end of communism by 2009 were no longer certain at all. Demands made by CEOs for less state, lower taxes, and fewer rules were replaced by desperate cries for help and bailouts. The same free marketeers who bemoaned welfare bums, scroungers, and hangers-on placed a burden on public finances across the globe never previously seen in peacetime. In terms of the effect that this had on national sovereignty, i.e. the ability of a government to enforce the kind of legislation that it is in the interests of those they serve, the results have been felt by most of us here in Britain and across the US and Europe for the past half-decade. Health, education, social care, libraries, sports centres, parks, and even policing have faced deep governmental cuts, and all the while the banks and other guilty parties have continued to meet at Davos. Yes, they have been quieter, and they have kept a far lower profile and been far less self-congratulatory, but it has, in essence, been business as usual. The ideological zeal that has caused the catastrophe has limped on and maintained its allure for our leaders. We have witnessed the strange non-death of neoliberalism. Politically literate Eurosceptics would no doubt wish to embrace the Davos set yet further. What better way to complete Britain's transformation back to a pre-welfare state workshop than to cast off the shackles of Brussels and the social market model it has pioneered? Following this, a purer version of neoliberalism would no doubt be the only medicine for the UK economy, and the only way it could conceivably function outside Europe. All this, of course, is utter madness. If we ignore for a moment the glaring problem that has been glazed over by Farage and co., that nearly half of our trade is with Europe, and that being outside the political club of European nations will cripple the UK, simple geography will still mean that our relationship with Europe will indefinitely continue in one way or another. So what does this mean to the ordinary investor? National sovereignty, in one guise or another, is a thing of the past, and this really is part of a wider economic trend of convergence that will be a dominant feature of the 21st century world. The financial behemoths of Davos, the self-styled masters of the universe, are still in charge, and their tool, paper currency, is becoming increasingly toxic. If you'd like to learn about how to protect yourself from coming financial dangers emanating from a Swiss resort near you, and to look at a range of solid investments, visit www.markets-uk.com. It's always good to know that there's an alternative. Thanks very much for listening. I've been Nick Shepley, and I'll be back next week with another 15 minutes of rant, vitriol, bile and invective.